Broadcasting Network.
Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It is Friday, July 20th, 2012 here. End of the week, Pauhana Friday, going into what appears to be a very crazy weekend. As you know, we've got the Olympics coming up, and everybody's concerned about this escalation and all of these false flag attacks and just this constant drumbeat. There are terrorists out there. Be afraid. Be afraid. Run to government and do what they tell you, or all sorts of bad things will happen to you. And we'll be getting to that a little bit later in the show here. Also in the show today, joining us is Henry Cliffords in our third hour. He's the guy who behind all these pro-Palestinian billboards that are popping up in train stations and bus stations and showing how Israel has just basically been nibbling away at Palestine and caused such a furor with the ADL because you're not allowed to be pro-Palestinian in the United States of America. You know, we didn't give you a First Amendment so you could criticize Israel. I mean, what the heck is wrong with that? So we'll be talking to him a little bit later in the show. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. The lovely Miss Crystal is running our control room today and twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, and she'll be answering the phones this morning when you call on in. A little program note for next week. Paul Craig Roberts and Jim Rogers will be joining us as our on-air guests. Now, before we get into the stories, and there's a lot of really bad stuff to talk about here today, but I do want to note, July 20th seems to pile up the anniversaries because it was on this day in 1969 that Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and 36 years ago today, back in 1976, the Viking missions. Viking 1 landed on Mars. And, of course, that's a little of my own personal history here. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. Between Apollo and Viking, we've come to understand that a lot of the meteors found here on Earth are actually bits of these other worlds that were knocked off by asteroidal collision and fall to Earth. And as a matter of fact, while it is still a felony to own any of the moon rocks from Apollo 11, you can actually go out and buy pieces of the moon and Mars that are basically identified from meteors found on Earth that match the data that came back from Viking and Apollo. And this is a little tiny piece of Mars, and this is a little tiny piece of the moon, and I got these on eBay for like $10 each. So if you're a science teacher, these are a wonderful thing to put in kids' hands and sort of tactilely connect them with the universe and good things like that. All right, well, also, of course, on this day 19 years ago, the body of White House Deputy Counsel Vincent Foster was found in Fort Marcy Park outside Washington, D.C. That was the story which brought the wrath of the Clinton White House down on my head and resulted in my blacklisting out of Hollywood and the launching of my career as a blogger and a talk show radio host. So that's the history, and now, of course, we have a lot of other things going on. As you're probably already aware, because the corporate media is talking about nothing else right now, last night in Colorado, at a midnight showing of the new Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises, a gentleman dressed in black with a hood barged through an open exit door with a couple of guns, an AK, and basically shot up a bunch of people. 14 people dead. The reports keep varying, but they're saying 14 dead. At least 50, 60 others were wounded. And, of course, the media is just going into a complete furor over this. And I understand. This is a horrible, horrible crime. And I think this case illustrates perfectly that the time has come to abandon the antiquated First Amendment and ban all Batman movies from now on. Now, obviously, I'm making light of a serious subject. The gun grabbers are just going orgasmic. They've got another bloody tragedy to wave around here and say, we've got to ban guns. We've got to take guns away from everybody, except, of course, for the Army. The House just passed another $606 billion to make sure the Army has the biggest guns in the world. So, conquering guns, good. Civilian guns, bad. We'll be back with more of this after these words from our sponsors.
It means to
right. At a token liberal, pretend I'm fair. A bimbo for some sex appeal. I'm busy oiling up the corporation wheel, and they call me US Steel.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and we're talking about how the gun grabbers are already in a lather over this latest tragedy down there in Colorado, where this guy walks in with a bunch of guns and he blows away a bunch of people watching the Batman movie, which, it is a tragedy. There's no way around it. It's a very, very bad thing to happen. But the gun grabbers are saying this proves we have to ban guns. And, of course, my position is exactly the opposite. If just one of those hundreds and hundreds of theatergoers had been carrying a gun, this nutcase would have been stopped in his tracks, because, as this Colorado shooting illustrates, the police are never there in time to stop a crime. That's the big fraud of the police department. They don't stop crime. They'll show up after it's all over. They'll pose with the dead bodies for the newspapers to prove how necessary they are to society. But they're never there in time to thwart a crime. The reality is that crimes that are stopped in process, crimes that do not go through to completion, are stopped by citizens with legally owned firearms. Now, we had this other story about there's this gun range that's running over in Israel where American tourists can play with machine guns and shoot at targets dressed like Palestinians and presumably now holding movie tickets. And between that and this total saturation of war movies on TV to glamorize and glorify war, and a federal government that has for the last 10 years sent the constant message to everybody on the planet that the solution to every problem is bloodshed, it's not the guns that were the issue. It's the militant, warlike culture that our government is trying to impose on all of us here. Now, you are far more likely to die from bad prescription medications than you are to be shot by somebody in a random shooting in the street. In fact, the reason shootings like happen in the theater are newsworthy is because they are unusual and rare. But every day, hundreds of people are killed by bad prescription medication. You never see that reported on TV. It's part of the background noise. More people are killed with baseball bats than with assault rifles in the United States of America. That hardly ever gets reported. It's not spectacular enough. Doesn't serve the agenda of disarmament. And there is a built-in bias in the media reporting on these situations. You know, every time some set-up patsy blasts a bunch of people, it's headline news and calling for gun bans and get rid of that Second Amendment. But every time a law-abiding citizen with a gun halts a crime in progress, the media ignores the story, or they trivialize it or minimize it. No bleed, no lead. And dictatorships hate news stories that show the positive side of citizens carrying guns. Let me give you another good example of that. Remember the shooting at Virginia Tech? It was national news. Shooter kills 32 students on a campus that had a gun ban. But there was another incident at the Appalachian School of Law where somebody tried to go on a shooting rampage and was stopped cold in their tracks by students with legally owned firearms. No, we're not going to bother reporting that. That doesn't serve the purpose here. That's going to make people think owning guns are good. Every year, 1.6 million crimes are stopped in progress by Americans who own legally owned firearms. Back in the 90s, I was one of them. Caught a guy trying to burglarize our home, Christmas season. And I persuaded him to leave our home. And I called the police to report the crime. They never even showed up. No, we can't take police reports about Americans defending their own homes with guns. No. They'll start thinking they don't need the police. Because after all, the police are never there in time to stop a crime. Think about it. They aren't. And last night proves it. They're never there in time to stop a crime. They show up after it's all over to pick up the bodies and pose for the newspaper photographers and say, look at our shiny badges. We are keeping law and order in society. No, they're not. They're handing out traffic tickets, and they're pounding on the Occupy protesters. They are not a deterrent to crime, and the present circumstance absolutely proves that. Now, one other point, and if you thought the Bulgarian bus bombing story was just Twilight Zone, this one's even weirder. Okay? Now, this guy, James Holmes, who was the shooter last night, first of all, I'm wondering why he's alive. I mean, the cops are so trigger-happy in this country we're in it right now. They shot that guy up in San Francisco, and they tried to say, we thought he had a knife. We didn't know it. We thought he had a knife, and they shot and killed him. Turned out he was in handcuffs at the time. And yet, this guy who's just wasted an entire theater, and somehow he's still alive, that alone raises eyebrows. Maybe they're keeping him alive so he can go on the news and say, Iran made me do it. I was helpless. They brainwashed me. My mistake. I bought a Persian rug, and it just took over my mind. Anyway, the guy is, you say, is he a veteran? Is he on psychological drugs? Is he this? Is he that? He's apparently a medical student. He's a graduate student in the neuroscience program at the University of Colorado Medical School. He was actually scheduled to do a presentation on microRNA biomarkers. This guy just doesn't seem like the type to just all of a sudden walk into a theater and start shooting. Unless somebody gave him like a massive dose of LSD or otherwise Manchurian candidate him. It's really weird. But they're going to be pounding on this as hard as they can, and it gives the media an excuse not to talk about LIBOR, not to talk about how the Bulgarian gambit is cratering before the eyes of the world, and the obvious rush to wars in, well, pick a country, any country. The U.S. is attacking everybody. That's how they're going to try and distract from the economic meltdown here. Coming up here is a good example of journalism versus propaganda, and it relates to that situation in the bus bombing in Bulgaria. The propaganda is, okay, almost immediately after the bombing killed 5 Israeli tourists, Israeli officials led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu blamed Iran. An accusation uncritically repeated by all the Western media outlets. That's propaganda. Real, honest, accurate journalism is Israel offered no concrete evidence tying the bombing to Iran. And Bulgarian officials cautioned it was too early to attribute responsibility. Now, there's something here to keep in mind. Apparently, the initial reports that the bomber up there in Bulgaria was a former inmate at Guantanamo and was tortured for 2 years. Now that's being denied. The Bulgarian government is saying it's not that individual because they had that individual under surveillance at the time because they understand that when the CIA tortures somebody for 2 years, they might not reintegrate into society perfectly smoothly. So they were keeping an eye on this guy. And not the Bulgarian officials, the Swedish officials were keeping an eye on this guy. So they know it wasn't him. So the reality is nobody knows who it was. It's some guy, looks like he could be a brother to Adam Perlman, or Adam Gadon, rather. And he's got a phony ID that was designed to be spotted by Border Patrols, because it's a Michigan state license with a Louisiana address on it. It's like, wave a flag. Look at me, I'm a fake ID. And nobody knows who he is. Israel doesn't claim to know who he is. Therefore, they really, again, they don't have any evidence at all to say Iran had anything to do with it. And why would Iran do something like that? Of all the players out there, NATO, the U.S., Israel, all of these nations, the only one who doesn't want a war is Iran. So why would Iran do something that absolutely hands to Israel and the United States the excuse to go to war? And the answer is they wouldn't. Who benefits from this? Israel wants the war as long as American kids die in it. The U.S. wants the war. Of course, this bombing of the Bulgarian bus is a false flag operation. And for all we know, the one in Colorado is to distract from one PR disaster with another PR disaster, or to pre-sell the idea it's a violent time and there are crazies all over. So when the Big Bang happens in the Olympics to kick off World War III into high gear, everybody's going to say, well, it's just a continuation of what's been going along. Maybe Israel's rush to get the war into Iran going like right today is because they're afraid somebody will identify who this bomber really was. And it's going to turn out to be another planted phony like Adam Perlman or Joseph Cohen or all of the rest of these guys pretending to be Al-Qaeda to scare us into war on Israel's enemies. Smoke and mirrors, and nothing is what it seems to be by way of deception. All righty, let's see. Of course, Israel's slaves, Israel's minions here in the United States of America are already out there just echoing things. Yes, time to attack Iran. Israel has a legitimate reason to attack Iran. No, they don't. They don't have any legitimate reason to attack Iran. They never did. They tried the weapons of mass destruction. That didn't work. Nobody's buying that one because of the lies about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. So now an explosion happens in Bulgaria, and Israel says, aha, Iran's behind it. We just know. We have no proof. We just know because we called up Miss Cleo, and she looked in her crystal ball and swizzled around the tea leaves and tapped her little Ouija board, and it says, ah, yes, Iran did it, so we're off to war. Think Lavon affair. Think USS Liberty. Think by way of deception. Think all war is based on deception. Every nation, every government, every ruler that tries to start a war has to lie their people into it. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back.